fascinating. We were just talking actually about a new book that's out, which is called "The End of the World is Flat," which is sort of satire written by Simon Edge, all about social media and how kind of ridiculous it has become in the way that it's kind of involved with an awful lot of people recreating history, redesigning history, telling you misinformation and expecting you to believe it, and sort of generally piling on people and being objectionable if you don't agree with them.
Absolutely right. And in some ways, the flat earth debate's a good place to start, because it also reminds us that fake news, disinformation has always existed. People have always had conspiracy theories. But what we see now is that social media can be hijacked by people to create a totally distorted impression that lots of other people believe these conspiracies as well. And it's the experience of social media, which is so unlike any other media we've had, where it becomes a personalized channel where people can be radicalized to believe extraordinary things, some things that could be personally harmful to them.
Yeah, and the online safety bill obviously covers a great many areas. So what does it mean for you as an MP? You're chairing the committee that's sort of going through it line by line. What is it that you're looking for it to do, if you like?
So the bill itself creates a mechanism whereby an independent regulator can hold to account social media companies for whether they take down and remove harmful content and illegal content, and they take it down because it's against their own terms of service or it's illegal and should be removed anyway. So an independent body will have the power to do that, and crucially, the power to go into the big tech companies and demand access to data and information as part of their investigations in a way that we just can't do at the moment.
Right.
I think there. Sorry, go on.
No, you carry on.
So, and I think there are two levels to this. There's one that we're quite familiar with, which is people post bad content that they shouldn't post, and there are cases where that should be removed. And if you see like the racist abuse of the England players after the European Championships final is an example of that. There's another level to this too, though, which I think is really important to the work we'll do on the committee looking at this bill. It's not just that social media companies are ineffective at removing this sort of content. Sometimes they actively promote it. Sometimes their recommendation tools are pushing it at people. And that is the thing that makes social media different. It's not just that bad stuff exists on those platforms that isn't taken down. It's that those platforms have a business model that's based around driving engagement, and they're not fussy enough about what engagement that is. And it could be engagement of harmful content and conspiracy theories. And if they think that will hold them on the platform, they'll just direct more of it at people. And that's something that I think we've got to stop.
And I think some of the decision-making, which I think you and I probably both know is not based upon rational thought, but it's based upon some kind of algorithm which is out there. Because we've obviously experienced an interesting side of social media here at Talk Radio when YouTube took our channel down for no apparent reason, while they left all sorts of other stuff up, which was far more harmful than anything we were saying. And we were obviously being regulated by Ofcom, who didn't have a problem with anything we were doing, but YouTube took it upon themselves to decide that they didn't like what we were doing, in the same way that I've sometimes posted interviews that I've done on an Ofcom regulated radio station on Facebook, at which they give a warning out to say that some of this information may not be true. And I'm thinking to myself, well, hang on a minute, who says that it may not be true? Some spotty guy in Palo Alto in California.
Well, that's right. And I think you've highlighted a really important issue, which is that you're a media organisation regulated by Ofcom. That doesn't mean you don't have free speech on your programme and your guests don't have free speech, but nevertheless, there's a regulator that oversees the work that you will do. And I think for organisations like that, they need to be not caught up in the provisions in this bill. We shouldn't see this bill as a way of trying to censor journalism and freedom of speech. It's not. It's creating rules for social media companies to deal with illegal content and the most harmful content. But what the bill says is that there should be a general exemption from these provisions for media organisations which themselves are already separately regulated.
Yes, and one of the aims of the bill is to threaten fines of up to 10% of annual global turnover, which is an awful lot of money, I would imagine, to some of these big American companies and these big tech companies. Is that something that you believe is achievable?
I think it's necessary, because I think without those sorts of real financial sanctions, I think the tech companies would see being in breach of the code as a minor thing. If they're levied a very small fine, that for them, a fine of several £1 million for them is kind of, barely noticeable. So these companies are worth, tens of billions of pounds. So it's got to be a meaningful fine, because sadly, I think the court of public opinion doesn't hold that much sway over them. They're not too bothered about being exposed as having done something bad in the media, because they don't think it affects their bottom line. They don't think it affects their profits. And I think that's why you have to have the power to levy very large fines for companies that are guilty of the most serious offences.
Yeah.
And the companies that are put in that position would be companies that have not only been in breach of the rules, but have made it quite clear they've got no intention of ever complying. And therefore, in that situation, the regulator's got to be able to intervene in a meaningful way.
Right. And of course, one of the protections that you would want to improve on, I presume, is the protection of children. Because a lot of children, if they have a smartphone, and many do at quite a young age, can pretty much access anything they want, because they can either pretend to be older than they are, or they can simply sign into something pretending to be somebody else. They can invent an email address. You know what I mean? It's not that difficult if you're quite a smart kid, which most kids are. They're going to be all over it.
I think that's right, and I think there's a question about how age verification works for children accessing social media. We all know that children younger than 13 do that, and that there's very little to stop them doing it. There's very little the tech companies do to make that hard. And therefore, there is that question about how do we improve age verification so that we can protect young people from content that they shouldn't be exposed to. There's something else too, which I think is really important. And I know from my own children, my daughter's 14. They will say that there's a lot of content that's recommended by social media platforms, which can be quite disturbing. It can include images of self-harm, and you've got to say, well, why is that content there? But more importantly, why is that content being directed to vulnerable users and children?
Yes. And you also want people to contribute to your process that you're going through currently. You want sort of public interaction with you. How do they do that if they want to know what's going on?
So what we'd like in particular is that because social media ultimately is personal, and everyone's newsfeed or timeline will be different depending on their data profile and how they use the site. But if people feel they're seeing harmful content actively promoted for them and directed at them, so that could be if you're on YouTube, it's the film recommended as next up. It could be something in your Facebook or Instagram newsfeed. It could be something recommended on For You on TikTok. If you're seeing something being directed at you don't like and you think it's harmful, if you could screenshot that and send it to the Joint Committee, we'll protect people's personal information and their identity. But we want to try and gather evidence of how the algorithms of social media may be actively promoting harmful content, and we want to try and gather that evidence before we question the big tech companies about it. So it will be very helpful to us if people could keep an eye out for that sort of content and let us know about it if they see it.
Okay, and the process of examining the bill goes on for how long?
So the process has to be completed by the 10th of December. We have to produce a report to Parliament, and the government has to respond within 8 weeks. And this is the final process of scrutiny before the government publishes the final bill to be debated on the floor of the House of Commons. So we'll be holding evidence sessions in Parliament from September through to the deadline in December. We've put out a call for people to send in written evidence, and we will produce our report by the 10th of December.
Okay, brilliant stuff. One final question, if I can, just ask you about your local region, your MP for Folkestone and Hythe, which is obviously right smack in the middle of where a lot of migrant boats are turning up at the moment. There's an awful lot of interest in this story. Whenever we talk about it, we get a load of calls on it. People feel very strongly about what's being done. Are you confident that Priti Patel is going to finally do something about this?
Yeah, I think she's absolutely determined to do that. And I think what she's recognised is that to be ultimately effective, we've got to change the law. We've got to get rid of this false incentive that exists for people to try and jump the queue into the asylum system by crossing the channel in a small boat. Yeah. We can do a lot to try and detect those boats on the French coast before they get in the water. But once they're in the water, because interception at sea is so difficult, you're largely waiting for them to arrive in the UK before the authorities pick them up and they're processed in the system. So if we want to stop them doing it, we've got to create a powerful disincentive for people to make those journeys which ultimately have and will in the future cause loss of life. And therefore, we shouldn't accept people making these very dangerous journeys because they believe that it's a shortcut into the asylum system in the UK. So I think it's right for the Home Secretary to say in the new bill going through Parliament that you can't get indefinite leave to remain in the UK if you enter the country illegally in a small boat, and that you may also find that you've broken the law in doing so, and may even find yourself receiving a prison sentence as a consequence of this. And I think that getting that message across to say, look, there are safe routes there are safe legal routes for asylum seekers and refugees to claim asylum in the UK. We work with the United Nations to make those routes available to people, particularly people in war zones, and when we know there are displaced people who are seeking safety and asylum. use the legal routes. Don't try and make these dangerous journeys across the Channel.
Right. I'm duty bound to give you an idea, because I had this from one of our listeners who called in and said, people are talking about setting up, schemes abroad, setting up islands where people could be taken. This, I think, actually genuinely quite a good idea. He said, how about a cruise ship? Put a cruise ship somewhere off the shore of this country, and everybody who arrives doesn't get taken into land, but they get taken to the cruise ship. It could be secure. It could be good for holding women and men and children. It would be perfectly humane, and they could make their application from there. And if it doesn't work, then they haven't actually landed in Britain.
Well, I think if it was in international waters, that would be the case. I think it's the question of how you would get people onto the ship, though. And they would have to probably come to the country first. So it's an interesting idea, but it may not be the most practical. But it's,
Okay, well, listen, I always say that I'll pass them on whenever I talk to anybody in power, as indeed you are, Damian. Thanks very much indeed